and I don't believe in God, am I going to hell or heaven as it relates to the scriptures?
But heaven isn't full of good people. But I think what's interesting is that the cross was not a contingency plan. Sure. I mean, in one sense, you don't want fair, because fair is you going to hell. I had fallen asleep, a nap, for probably no more than 30 minutes. And when I woke up, I was paralyzed.
This is Wes Huff, a scholar and PhD candidate at the University of Toronto who spends his life scrutinizing ancient biblical manuscripts. He recently took his expertise to the diary of a CEO for a massive 2-hour deep dive into hard questions about the Christian faith. I've condensed that entire interview into the key takeaways that are currently sparking debates for Christians and skeptics alike. Because whether you believe it or not, what Wes shares here challenges the very way we view reality.
Man, I wondered how much the situation in these photos had an impact on who you came to be and what you came to believe. I'll put these photos on the screen for anybody.
Yep.
But this is a young boy in a wheelchair.
Yep.
And in a hospital bed that looks to be paralyzed.
Yep. Yep. When I was 11 years old, I was diagnosed with a rare neurological condition that left me paralyzed from the waist down.
So at 10, you were fine, you were normal.
Yeah.
And at 11, suddenly you were paralyzed from the waist down.
Yes. So I had the flu, and my body's immune system, instead of attacking the flu, attacked the nerve endings at the base of my spinal cord, so the myelin sheath, and caused inflammation, cutting off the communication from my brain to my legs.
And a lot of people that get that disease never walk again.
It's complicated. So it's called acute transverse myelitis, although I've been told recently that there's a change in the name of the diagnosis. But essentially, transverse myelitis is not all that rare, but acute in terms of the quickness of it, I had fallen asleep, a nap, for probably no more than 30 minutes. And when I woke up, I was paralyzed. So it was the quickness of the actual damage that was done to my spinal cord that was the catalyst for, in the diagnosis, saying that the chances of me walking again were very low.
But within a month, you were walking again?
Yeah, 1 month to the day. So, in fact, the 23-year anniversary was recently, because it was in February 8th. I woke up on a Saturday morning, got out of bed, and walked over to my wheelchair.
Did this change your perspective on God, Christianity, religion?
It did in some ways. I mean, I don't know how it couldn't. It definitely, to have medical professionals tell me, you're probably going to be a paraplegic for the rest of your life. Like, this is what you need to kind of accept and get used to the exact same medical professionals, the pediatric neurologists saying, we don't know while you're walking. That had to have an impact on me, in that I think I truly believe I was healed, in that it was the doctors who used the word miracle. I think we were created for community. I think we are, as human beings, a creature that is created for community. Ultimately, like cards on the table as a Christian, because I believe we are created in the image of a God who exists in a set of living, loving relationships. Like, that's what the Trinity is. When we talk about that idea within Christian theology, God exists in Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And so being created in the image of God, part of that is you are created for relationship. And so in a society that's continually removing us, you need to be an influencer. You're influencing everybody else. Mm-hmm. When I think we're not created to be lone wolves or lone rangers. We're created to live amongst community and have that be something that likewise gives us fulfillment.
That really, everybody kind of agrees that there was a guy called Jesus from Nazareth and that he was a real historical person. I guess the part in dispute was whether things like his resurrection actually happened or whether he was just a spiritual leader back then, like we have spiritual leaders today. And I think one of the things that I got really stuck on when I was reading about Jesus in the Bible was there appears to be quite a significant gap between his life, his death, and then the writings that go into the Bible. And for me, in my head, I was like, well, if something happened in my life 50 years ago, I mean, I'm only 33, but if something happened 50 years ago, I would not be able to recount it. Frankly, I can't recount what happened last week accurately,
Right.
let alone like decades ago. You must have heard this argument before.
Yes.
How do you square the circle here? Logically, there's quite a risk of Chinese whispers to some degree. As you were speaking, I was trying to think about things that I experienced when I was younger, with my grandmother before she passed away, and I was trying to accurately recount those memories.
Yeah.
I was thinking of going to her house, and then I remember one day she gave me some money, but I can't remember what she gave it to me for, and I can't remember how much she gave me. I know she put it in a card, and this was only 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And so if I was to write about that today, I would be filling in some gaps.
Definitely.
Especially, this is the other thing that I always struggled with is especially in a world where we didn't understand science. Now, my grandmother put it in a card and it was I opened it, and the way she did it was often as a surprise. So in a world where I didn't understand physics or science, I might have concluded that my grandmother did something magical. Mm-hmm. At a time when we didn't understand anything about really much about the nature of the universe and planets and the solar system and physics. So is that a risk that some of the things that have been transmuted via God into this book in front of me are prone to Chinese whispers and or just a lack of understanding about the nature of the world, like the resurrection, for example?
Yeah. I think the Chinese whispers or the telephone game or whatever you call it is a good kind of case study. I think where it falls short is that if you play the telephone game, if you play Chinese whispers, there are rules in order to corrupt the message. So you have to whisper, you can only say it once, you have to do it one person to one person. In an oral culture, you would have been hearing these stories constantly. So when some of these stories are told, they're being told within a lifetime where there could have been individuals who say the story of the feeding of the 5,000, that's a lot of people. So there's a lot of witnesses to this particular event. So if you're writing this down, there's an aspect of there are people out there who could verify what is being said, at least orally, not necessarily literarily. Likewise, what we have in the gospel accounts, particularly after Jesus' death, when the disciples proclaim his resurrection, they go back to Jerusalem, which is the scene of the crime. So they go back to the exact place where Jesus was crucified and start telling people he was risen from the dead. If there is some aspect of, say, disingenuousness in making up a story, don't go back to the place where everybody could have seen that thing happen. To that degree, right? So in one sense, Chinese whispers is a faulty analogy in that it's less like one person whispering into another's ear and more like 100 people in a room all communicating the thing verbally and then getting the other people to repeat it back to them and then corroborating with the other individuals of what's going on. Now, I think your point in the story of your grandmother and the letter and is a good one. How do we remember things? Do you remember 9/11?
Yes, I do. Yes, and I was in the UK at the time.
Could you tell me a little bit more vividly what you were doing on 9/11 compared to your grandmother and the letter?
Yes, I could, yeah. I remember coming home from school and watching it on the screen and my dad having it on the screen and us all just looking at the screen.
Yeah, me too. So whereas I couldn't tell you much of what else happened during an average day in that year, I could tell you what happened on September 11th, 2001. And that's because of the nature of what was going on. And I think when we're talking about the gospel stories in particular, first you have what I genuinely believe are eyewitness accounts from at least the source information coming from a group who would have heard Jesus be preaching these things multiple times in multiple different settings. They've been traveling with this rabbi for 3 years straight. They've been hearing his teaching. They've been seeing miracles, at least that are recorded in the Gospels. Pretty phenomenal things. And then he gets taken and he's murdered publicly. And they think it's over. They think, there are other messianic movements in the ancient world, most of which you and I aren't hearing on a regular basis, because when those individuals die, their movement dies with them. And so that's what they think is happening, right? So they think, okay, we're done. So the story is they're hiding in this upper room and they're scared. In fact, it's the women who take on the responsibility of going and figuring things out, which in terms of the time period is actually an embarrassing fact because of the kind of cultural dynamics of what's going on. And so you have the disciples who think it's over. What is it that has 11 scared disciples, because one of them, Judas, goes and he kills himself, 11 scared disciples hiding in an upper room thinking, that's it, we're done. We might as well, Peter, James, and John might as well just go back to being fishermen because that's all she wrote. To then having the boldness to go out and actually proclaim this message, ultimately to the level of persecution and hardship that they endure for the rest of their lives. Well, it's that their rabbi then shows up alive again. And so at minimum, I think what we can say is that this is a pretty drastic event that takes place in their life. It's a comparative to a 9/11 event for them. And so in terms of the memory imprint that they are experiencing for the murder of their rabbi, of their teacher, and then something happening where they then go for the rest of their lives. The martyrdom stories are a little bit tricky in terms of their historical reliability. I think a few of them we can say did happen. A lot of them is kind of up in the air. But at minimum, they suffered persecution. I think it's interesting also that we have 4 accounts that kind of give different angles on the stories. It's not as if they got together and they corroborated and all gave the same story. The fact is that we have 4 accounts that kind of capitalize on different angles, which the differentiation in detail, I think, actually gives credibility to the reliability of it. Because if they were all telling the same thing, you could argue that they got together and they colluded. They don't do that. In fact, they touch on different aspects of the story.
Are these people saying that they saw him walk out? Are they saying that they just saw it empty? What is the claims being made about his resurrection from these witnesses?
Yeah, so the tomb is empty.
The tomb is empty.
And so it's interesting, in one of the accounts, Mary's at the tomb, and she actually talks to Jesus, but she confuses him with a gardener. Now, I think it's interesting that she doesn't confuse the gardener with Jesus. She confuses Jesus with the gardener. She thinks that this person she's talking to isn't Jesus. She doesn't recognize him at first. And she asks him, what happened? Why is the tomb opened? Where did the body go? And then there's also an account of an angel appearing and saying, why are you looking for the living among the dead? He's not here. He's risen. And then they go back to the disciples who are, hiding in this upper room. Mary says, I met Jesus. The tomb's empty. I've met Jesus. Jesus is not in the tomb. He's risen.
Something in human nature where we do have a proclivity to engage in supernatural sightings. And then once we've heard it once, we then reinforce that we've seen it too. And even as a young man, maybe you believe this, but I believed that there was a woman that would stand on the landing of my home and it would wake me up and I would run and tell my parents that the lady stood on the landing again. There's people watching this that think there was actually a lady. Maybe there was. But you know what I'm getting at is how can we trust human accounts of these things when clearly humans have an ability to make things up that aren't real in some situations?
Sure. Part of the answer to the question is one of the evidences for Jesus' resurrection is the fact that you and I, Stephen, are still talking about it almost 2,000 years later.
My friend said this to me. I was telling you before about my Christian friend. He was like, why are we still talking about it? Well, we can't prove it.
Right.
It didn't happen. So we're always going to talk about it. There's never going to be, unless something happens.
Right. The difference is that there are these other messianic movements that happen in the ancient world. Mm-hmm. And so Simon Bar Giora. The reason why we're not talking about Simon Bar Giora as a messianic figure is because he died and his movement died with him. And his disciples didn't go out and then proclaim his continued message until, to their own detriment. So I would say a few things. I would say liars make poor martyrs in that you will die for something you believe is true, but the chances of you dying for something you know is not true are less likely. So if we're talking about the disciples, and especially if what they're getting for this particular proclamation is they're being ostracized from their own communities, pagan, Gentile communities, and the Jewish communities. Because remember, there was persecution on both sides because it was at a certain point in time continuing to say that Jesus was the Messiah, and on top of that, that he was God himself, was not very popular within the early Jesus communities. There's a complexity to the fact that people usually lie. You look at cultic figures, right? Cult leaders usually do things for prominence or money or sex or influence. The interesting thing about the early disciples is they get none of that. In fact, they almost get the complete opposite of that, in that Jesus says, you're going to be persecuted. You're going to be put in front of tribunals and you're going to be interrogated. And that's exactly what happens. And they know that there's a danger to this because we have in the book of Acts, which is the book after the Gospels, we have a recounting of the first martyr, of Stephen. Why then, especially experiencing that persecution, seeing their friends die in that kind of setting, do they continue to go on and do it?
I think they definitely believed it was true.
Yes. I think at minimum, whatever's going on, they, like, you look at some of these secular historians and they look at the data and they say, whatever's going on, the disciples believe something happened.
Yeah, I
that
agree.
they saw something.
Of course. Do you have any doubt?
Oh, of course.
Okay, so you have at least even 1% doubt.
Oh, definitely. And I think especially when there are times of things that are far more existential than historical, when times of like struggle and pain and suffering, and I look at the world and I look at how messy it is, children who die young, people who are abused, all of these things. There are moments where I think, how could there be a good God? I mean, I'm not immune to doubt. And the interesting thing that I find about the Bible is that the Bible is very open to the God of the Bible being open to us coming to him with our doubts. Mm-hmm. You know, 1/3 of the book of Psalms, which is like right in the middle of the Bible, this kind of poetic literature, if you want to call it that, are sometimes referred to as the lament or the complaint Psalms. It's things like Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from me? I cry out by day and I hear no answer. And I think what's interesting that I find with the Bible is its transparency in saying we're going to struggle. You know, there's this really great story in the Gospel of John. Well, it's in a couple of the instances of the Gospels where John the Baptist, who's like Jesus' cousin and good friend, he's been in prison because he's been speaking out against Herod. He's been being a little bit too verbal politically, and so he gets taken. And he's in prison, and though he's the one that baptized Jesus and said, you know, behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world, when he's in prison, he doubts. And he sends his disciples over to Jesus to ask, are you the Messiah? Are you the one we're waiting for? Or should we be waiting for another? Now, in that interaction, Jesus actually says, John the Baptist is the greatest of all men born of women, which is basically everybody, right? And yet, in that very same setting, John the Baptist is doubting that Jesus is who he says he is because he's experiencing pain and suffering.
Do you believe in evolution?
I don't.
You don't believe it's true?
No. I am open to the fact that I don't think that a belief in evolution undermines Christianity in any way. However, and prefacing this by saying I'm not a scientist. I'm an advocate for intelligent design, and I would basically punt the complex conversations of evolutionary biology to individuals who are far more studied than me, like Stephen Meyer and Jonathan McClatchy and John Torres and Douglas Axe and those individuals who have studied it. At the exact same time, though, it also depends on what you mean by evolution, right? So like adaptation genetically is a thing.
I guess, so I'm saying, do you believe that we evolved from very simple organisms to become
No,
the
I
human
don't.
that you see today.
No.
And the argument for that would be, I share 98% of the same DNA as like a chimpanzee.
Sure.
And we have these fossil records which seem to show a progression over time.
Yeah.
You don't believe that's true?
No, I don't. But at the exact same time, I think, there are individuals within the Christian faith, intelligent people who do and have no problem with understanding of a theistic evolutionary model. However, I think in the effort of survival of the fittest, I still think that you're starting a few miles down the road in answering the question of the arrival of the fittest. How do minds come from mindless matter? How does everything come from nothing? How do we answer those questions? And I think that's why you can use the evolutionary model as an explanation of how God has actually created, right, the biology of the situation. But I think the bigger question is the cosmological questions. How did this all get going? The Big Bang, what was the Big Banger? And going back to talking about trying to explain these things scientifically, I always find we can explore the answer scientifically, but that's only going to get us so far, especially when we're discussing meaning and purpose questions. So let me give you a little bit of a story that a friend of mine, Glenn Scribner, likes to articulate in this parable that he tells that he calls Betty the Botanist. So you have Betty the Botanist, and she's been looking at a plant sample in her lab. She's been spending all weekend looking at this plant sample. She's been, investigating it and doing all of these tests on it all weekend. And Jerry, the lab assistant, comes in on Monday. And Betty looks at Jerry and says, "Jerry, thank you for the botanical specimen that you left me on the weekend. Thank you for this botanical specimen. I've been doing all of these tests. I've been looking at the components of it and the complexity of the biology, and there are pharmacological implications that I've extrapolated from its various biological components, and we can use these to cure diseases. There's so many things. Thank you so much for the botanical specimen." And Jerry says, "Betty, it was February 14th on the weekend. That was a long stem rose. Do you know what I left for you? Do you know what the implication of the botanical specimen, as you're calling it, was for what I was trying to communicate to you?" Now, did Betty the Botanist understand the long stem rose? In one way, she understood it more than most, because she had done all of the tests and run through all of the different ways that she could extrapolate what that thing was. But what Jerry was trying to actually illustrate was something that went beyond that. It was a love gift. He was trying to communicate something that went beyond the simple biology. And Betty could very simply say, well, I couldn't get that from the data. I couldn't have extrapolated the implications of it being a love gift. And in that, so far as it being a parable, we can look at all of the scientific explanations, but there's something that goes beyond the simple data in terms of meaning and purpose and desire, identity questions that go far beyond that, right? We can look, I could tell you the different chemical components that make up the page and the ink and the size of the paper and its transparency and all of that. I could say, Steven, what is this? And you could go into all of this explanation about how paper is made and the pulp and how we extrapolate it and eventually put it together in the binding. And I could say, okay, yeah, but this is a Bible. This is meant to communicate something to you. What is the explanation for this? One explanation could be the chemical and scientific components that make up the Bible. Another explanation could be this is a religious text that's actually trying to communicate something to you. And so I think in the scientific data, all of that is obviously important, right? There's this great quote by C.S. Lewis where he says that men were scientific because they expected laws in nature, and so they looked for the legislator. And you read individuals like Francis Bacon who came up with the scientific method, and they're inherently religious, right? They almost articulate what they're doing in their scientific endeavor as an act of worship, Because if the exploration of the creative world points to a creator, then that can be an act of understanding who and why we're here. In terms of the scientific questions, I'm very interested in them, especially as a non-scientist. They fascinate me. But in terms of the meaning questions, I think I would err on the side of caution of attempting to be Betty the botanist. And sometimes I read individuals like Dawkins, and I'm hearing Betty the botanist extrapolate and define the botanical specimen.
What's the point of this? Even in the example of evolution, but why am I evolving? Why am I trying to survive?
Yeah.
A means to what end? Okay, I'm trying to have more kids, but then why are my kids trying to have more kids? What's the point?
Right.
And you just keep hitting this wall of but what's the point? What's the point? Am I meant to do something? Is there a mission for me?
Right.
And I think that question is one that I think about sometimes, which is, no matter what I believe, what is the point?
And I think that's why the Bible is such an amazing explanation for that. Because in a world that tells you ultimately that you're a product of time plus matter plus chance, the Bible looks at you, Stephen, and says you're created with meaning and purpose and intention. You bear the image of God. So there's something that is actually screaming from your biology about who you are that goes beyond the fact that you're not just a physical specimen sitting in front of me.
So do you believe that me and you are born with a particular mission and meaning on this planet? Or do you think we have to go and find that particular meaning or mission?
That's a great question. I think the chief end of man is to know God and glorify him. But heaven isn't full of good people. Heaven is full of people who understand they are not good enough.
So if I don't believe in Jesus,
Yeah.
and I don't believe in the Bible, but I live a good life, I'm nice to people, I'm charitable, try and be kind wherever I can be,
Yeah.
and I don't believe in God, am I going to hell or heaven as it relates to the scriptures?
Well, I don't think if you're living your life rejecting God, God is not going to force you into his presence.
So I'm not going to go into heaven. I'm not going to go to heaven then.
No.
Where am I going to go?
Well, you would go to hell.
So if I don't believe in the Bible, in Jesus and God, then I'm going to go to hell.
Yes, insofar as if heaven is a place for those who have submitted their lives to Jesus, who are living the identity of what they're created to be, and said, your will be done, God.
Yeah.
Hell is a place where God says, you rejected me, your will be done. I'm going to give you what you want. In that, I'm going to remove my grace and mercy from you, and you are going to experience truly what you desire in being separated from me and my goodness and my grace.
And what is that place like according to the scripture? Give me a depiction in my mind of what hell might be like for me.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a good place. It's not a nice place. It's a place that no matter what's going on, if you are a believer, if you truly understand what this book is saying, seriously, I think it should motivate you to want to desire. Steven Bartlett, I desire you to have a personal relationship with your Creator because I don't want you to experience whatever hell is. I desire for you to be in perfect relationship with your God. Not necessarily because I want you to get a get out of hell free card, but because I actually think that in living how God created you to be, in accepting living out the image that you bear, you're going to find the meaning and purpose that you ultimately have expressed that you have this innate desire for. And I think the urgency of the Christian message is the bad news is really bad. And that's what makes the good news so good. Jesus has taken on that hell on your behalf. and it goes beyond simply a believing, right? It's not just about saying the right words. It's not just an incantation. You are not saved by what you do, right? You're saved by works. It's just Jesus's. Jesus lived the life you couldn't and made the sacrifice you can't on your behalf in order to establish that right relationship with God. So that's where grace comes into the picture. Justice is getting what you do deserve. Mercy is not getting what you do deserve. Grace is getting what you don't deserve. The miracle of this is that your salvation is received, not achieved. And so, once again, it's not about like brownie points. It's not about checking off, I read the Bible this many times, I went to church this many times, I didn't lie, I didn't steal, I didn't cheat, because we still exist in this beautiful yet broken world, and because we live in a world that is marred by the brokenness of the fall, of our first parents, Adam and Eve, making that decision to rebel against God. And because of that, now the creation itself has been affected. It's not about trying to earn my way into heaven. So is it a very small percentage of people who are actually repenting? Maybe, but what of that percentage is who fully understands? It's interesting, the word that we translate as repentance is the Greek word metanoia. It means change your mind. And so there's an aspect of, it's not just about the doing. It's an understanding. It's a component of, I don't want to do these things. Even when I do them, I don't want to lie anymore. Like, I see the harm that causes and the brokenness that it creates. But I think what's interesting is that the cross was not a contingency plan. The cross was the plan all the way along. And so God is glorified in that act. And I think part of it is what I was saying before. If God is love, if love is the greatest ethic, and the greatest ethic is expressed in the greatest example, which is self-sacrifice, then God is actually communicating the greatest ethic in the greatest possible way in what we see in the gospel message of how he accomplishes the unification with his people for the goodness and glory of who he is. And do I understand all of the complexities and mysteries that go in conjunction with that? No. But I'm convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that the historical and the philosophical case for the existence of God, and then that God specifically being the God that is articulated in the Bible, is true. I've actually seen my own life change radically. So you're a friend, right? You say, like, you've seen an actual experiential change in that person's life.
Oh, yeah. No, my friend, I talked about him anonymously on here, but he then clipped it, posted it on his Instagram and said, Steven's talking about me.
Okay.
And he's like doing some interviews and stuff now. So I feel more comfortable talking about him more publicly. But yeah, my friend who was going through a little bit of a crisis of meaning in his life, was living in Dubai in this penthouse apartment, single, kind of alone, remote working, all those kinds of, very individualistic lifestyle, successful in a material sense, all of a sudden turned to Christianity, flew to America, got baptized, and is now Christian.
Yeah.
And would I say he is happier than before? 100%. Would I say I am very glad he became Christian? 100%. Would I say that I believe his future is going to be better because he's now Christian? 100%.
That's a lot of 100%.
No, but it's true. It's objectively true. Like, I even speak to, we've been friends for decades, and all of us feel the same way.
Right. Sure. I mean, in one sense, you don't want fair, because fair is you going to hell. And the gospel message is not fair, right? So the actual gospel message is not about fairness, because fairness is I get the just penalty for what I do, right? And that's where the whole concept of mercy and grace they're so central to the Christian message. Is Buddhism and Hinduism are based on fairness, solely based on fairness. Right? The cycle of samsara, of life, death, birth, and rebirth, the karmic cycles, that's fair. In one sense, what God does when he intervenes in humanity, when he incarnates, becomes flesh, steps into humanity, and actually experiences pain and hurt and suffering and death in a way that makes the God of the Bible unique and actually experiential to what you and I go through when we have those struggles and doubts. He then takes on the punishment that we deserve, and the fairness is not actually what is then given, because the fairness is Wes Huff getting what he actually deserves for the weight and the penalty of his cosmic rebellion in choosing a life that is against and away from God. I think probabilistically, though, with how the description of creation and the human condition and what we see within history, I think personally, the God of the Bible is the most reasonable explanation, especially when we're comparing it to other religious worldviews. I think the simulation theory is an interesting one, or, the string theory, multiple universes. I just think that those are almost like we're walking around the question. We're circling around the question, and it's not actually answering. We still need a God.
Yeah, and then, even in the example I gave of the 4-year-old messing around in his laptop 10 billion years ago in a technologically advanced civilization, my brain a few seconds later asked, well, what was the point of his life?
Yeah. And who created him?
And I could say the same about God, I guess. Like the God of the Christian Bible. Like, who is this God? Like, who created this God? Did someone create this God? Or is this has he always been there?
Right. I mean, philosophically, it's a category error, because all things that have a beginning have a creator. And philosophically, the God of the Bible is an entity that ontologically didn't have a beginning. So if we're talking about an unmoved mover, right, in the kind of Aristotelian categories of philosophy, God didn't have a creator because God is the author of creation.
Okay.
It's kind of like asking, what does blue smell like?
And God I should think of as like in the Bible, not in the Bible, but in depictions of God, it's like a guy with a beard.
Yeah. No.
Or it's like some mystical force that's kind of like a white light.
Right. No, I think, those are attempts, probably inadequately, to express aspects of how we would visually communicate who God is. I think that probably misses the mark more than it actually gets at what and who God is. I don't know if there's a proper way that could give a physical attribution and description of God other than Jesus, who is God incarnate, right? Could you think of a more powerful, a more amazing example of a God than one who actually enters into his creation?
My fiance says that God is love.
Yeah.
She says that a lot. My fiance tends to be right as well.
Nice.
So I tend to, in the first time she says something that I don't believe, I tend to assume it's not true for a while.
Yeah.
But then it tends to be proven to be true within a year. So when she said to me that God is love, I really thought deeply about it. I thought maybe she's right. Maybe love is God.
That's from the Bible. God is love. The thing grammatically that's interesting about that when John writes that in his epistle is grammatically in the Greek, it's phrased in a way that God is love, but love is not God, right? So you can't deify what love is. When you love your fiance, that isn't God. That's an inefficient description of what we know God to be. So God is love, but love is not God. And in that sense, going back to what I was saying, said a few times now, what the Bible is saying when it says God is love is that is the ultimate character of who God is.
There is a deep crisis of meaning in the world, especially in the Western world. 3 in 5 American adults between 18 and 25 years old said that their life lacked meaning and purpose, with 50% of the same group saying their poor mental health was linked to not knowing what to do with my life. And a lack of purpose is significantly associated with many of the mental health and illnesses like depression and anxiety. And as of April 2025, the overall prevalence of depression in US teenagers and adults has increased by 60% over the last decade, according to the CDC. And tragically, globally, more than almost 1 million people die due to suicide every year. And it's the third leading cause of death among 15 to 29-year-olds, according to the World Health Organization. What are we getting wrong?
I think we're looking for our purpose and our meaning in things that are ultimately not going to give the value that those things actually require. So it's not a matter of if we worship, it's a matter of what we worship. And worship, if worship is, giving our all to something, I think there's a lot of things within society that are going to tell us that our identity is going to be fulfilled in money, or it's going to be fulfilled in relationships or accolades, or all of these aspects are ultimately going to fall short in giving us actual purpose and meaning. And if they're not grounded in actually giving us value, right? Your friend is, as far as I understand, is a good example of that, right? We can achieve all of these things. You hear athletes and actors and famous people talk about all the wealth, all the celebrity status they could possibly desire, and being completely empty, being completely fulfilled-less. And I think that's because we're chasing after things that aren't going to give us what we actually need, right? They're facsimiles and cheap reproductions of what actually can give us meaning and purpose. And that's because we are created to be in relationship with our God. And that is where we will find our true identity. That's what's going to give us the motivation to actually get up in the morning. Like your friend, you saying, he couldn't get up in the morning. He finds not just a motivational value in the Christian faith. He finds actually meaning and purpose in the Christian faith. That getting up in the morning has a purpose that goes beyond the here and the now, and that can affect all of the people around him. And now he can pursue his entrepreneurial activities or his relationships or even his finances for the glory of God. And then that gives it an ontological meaning that goes beyond the simple basics of kind of what secular materialism has to offer.
So if that does hold, and we're implying there that sometimes it's to do with a feeling of worthlessness for men, are you saying that Christianity can provide something that is an antidote to that feeling?
I think not only can it provide an antidote, it can provide the antidote.